welcome to the Alameda High School and Castro High School Black Student Union Angela Davis guest speaker event. My name is Naomi Malak, Vice President of Castro High School's Black Student Union.
And I'm Naomi Abraham, Co-President of the Alameda High School's Black Student Union. And on behalf of all of our officers and club members, we want to thank you all so much for taking the time to come out here and spend an evening with us. Tonight we have an exciting discussion and panel with the revolutionary civil rights activist Angela Davis. Angela Davis is a prominent figure in American activism, known for her work in civil rights, feminism, and prison abolition. Born on January 26, 1944 in Birmingham, Alabama, Davis grew up in a segregated environment, which fueled her commitment to social justice.
She's authored several influential books such as Women, Race, and Class and Are Prisons Obsolete, which have become foundational texts in understanding the complexities of oppression and resistance. Having helped to popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audience to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. She is currently the Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness and Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
Today we are going to begin with a Q&A style panel featuring 4 students from our very own schools for approximately 40 minutes before we segue into a brief 20-minute intermission and return to conclude our event with another 30-minute panel. This time asking the questions we have pulled from you all, our audience members.
And at this time, we'd like to remind everyone that food and drinks are not allowed inside the theater, and while video is allowed, the entire event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, and the link will be forwarded to all of those who registered. We'll now transition into the first half of our panel with questions that our clubs have formulated, and please try to stay seated for the duration of the section, and we hope you enjoy.
Before we begin, we'd like to do introductions. My name is Diego De La Rosa. I'm president of Black Student Union at Castro High. I'm a junior.
My name is Harlan Rima. I am a senior and I'm social media manager at Alameda High.
My name is Veronica Bramley. I'm 15 and I am the co-treasurer at Alameda High.
And I'm Naomi Malak, a junior at Castro High School and Vice President of Black Student Union.
Professor, thank you for coming. Really appreciate you. We couldn't do this event without you. It is about you, but how are you doing today?
May I say something before we start? I am so happy to be here at Alameda High School. And I will tell you that some years ago, when I used to ride with the Oakland Yellow Jackets, we always did our recovery rides on Mondays, and we came right past your high school. But this is the very first time I've been inside, so I'm really happy this evening. Thank you so much for being here.
So, actually, I have to ask you, how's your day going?
My day's been good. I did my Pilates this morning and raised some weight. I did some writing. I always have writing projects. And I was looking forward to driving over to Alameda to meet with all of you.
Thank you so much. So you're ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right. So let's get into it. Before we
You know something? I actually do have some water. I stopped drinking out of plastic bottles. You know what I said? You know why? Anybody, tell me why.
Microplastics.
Because this entire planet is being polluted by plastic. Plastics are in our bodies. And so, I think we really need a campaign. We need a campaign on this campus, no more plastic bottles. In Alameda, in Oakland, in Berkeley, in San Francisco. And maybe we'll talk about the intersection between the movement for racial justice and the environmental justice.
Sorry about that. We gotta put this tomorrow. All right, so
I brought my own.
all right. Before we get into the deep questions, I think we should talk about how to have an effective discussion. So, how can we encourage meaningful dialogue between different political factions within like movements for social change? Because that's what divides like a lot of us, especially in America right now, are different views, different political views. So we want your perspective on that.
Well, that's a good question to begin with, and I would say there's difference, and there's difference. You know, there's difference with, for example, the former president who is currently on trial, whose name I don't like to mention in public. And there's difference among those of us who look forward to a more radical future. And I think that kind of difference is really productive. Don't you think it's boring to talk to people who agree with you about everything? I mean, difference can be a very, it can generate force, it can generate creativity, it can generate thought. And so always remember when you're in a conversation with someone with whom you do not entirely agree, that there are lessons to be learned from those who don't hold exactly your views. As a professor, I always encourage my students to think deeply and to not be afraid to disagree with the professor, because that is how we move forward. So, encourage that kind of conversation and recognize that if someone doesn't agree with you on this issue, that does not mean that you can't find ways to come together in order to achieve a larger goal.
Yeah, I feel like discussion with someone who disagrees with you, like they can like point out flaws in the argument and you can better improve on it. Thank you for the response.
Okay. So the documentary Free Angela and All Political Prisoners by Shona Lynch highlights your experience as a political prisoner, but it also sheds light on the broader contributions you have made to activism. And so with this in mind, how can you use your experience as a political prisoner shape your approach to activism advocacy, and did this experience fuel your passion for advocating for abolition?
for that question, because I do think that the time I spent as a political prisoner, the time that I spent in jail in New York, in Marin County, in San Rafael, and also in the San Jose area. They put me in a little jail in East Palo Alto, which was like really weird, but you know, as difficult as it was to be behind bars during that period, I've come to recognize how much of a gift it was. Because I don't think I would be who I am today had I not spent that time with other people in prison, with other women. And I think that the work that I've been doing over the last 50 years was definitely sparked by the time I spent in jail. And I still often think about the women I met during that time. Some of them I've kept in touch with, others I haven't. But as difficult as it was at the time, because when I was arrested, I was charged with 3 capital offenses, which meant that I could have received the death penalty 3 times. And that was pretty scary. And people often ask me, well, where did you find the strength to stand up to that? And I said, well, it wasn't about me, really. It wasn't about an individual attempt to generate courage within. It was really about all of the people who stood with me. And the fact that there was organizing happening all over California, there was organizing all over the country. So many people became involved in the campaign. And at that point, it was no longer really just about me. It was about the kind of system that thrived on the racist and political repression that claimed the lives of so many other people. I happened to be, at that time, the individual whose case was most focused on. But I did not think that it was about me primarily. And as a matter of fact, initially, the name of the organization was the National United Committee to Free Angela Davis. And I said, you can't be generating all of this power just to free one single person. Let's turn it into an organization that is dedicated to freeing all political prisoners. The name of the organization became the National United Committee to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. And therefore also the title of the film that you referenced. So yeah, I'm completely beholden to all of the work that was done. I mean, I meet people today. I'm like 80 years old. And I run across people all the time who tell me that they were involved in the campaign to free me. And so, my response is, okay, well, free Leonard Peltier. Abolish prison.
So, Professor Davis, I know you've spoken before about how you believe that capitalism and racism often go hand in hand. So I'm curious to know how you see the relationship between capitalism and racism intersecting, and what do you believe are some strategies that can be used to challenge these structures?
That's a great question. Thank you. And maybe I should say this as a preface. As people who are trying to learn about the world, we use certain ideas, we use certain theories, we use certain methodologies, we engage in analyses, and oftentimes what we do is we have to separate things in order to try to understand them. However, we also often forget that that act of separation is precisely an attempt to understand something that is always connected with other things. We think of racism as being separate from capitalism. But capitalism is racial capitalism. Capitalism and racism have always gone together. If we look at the era of colonialism, colonization, the genocide of indigenous people in this country, if we look at the slave trade, without those historical moments, capitalism never would have come into being. Without slavery, and particularly the cotton industry, capitalism, as we know it today, global capitalism, would not exist. So capitalism is always about racism, and racism is always about capitalism. Does everybody know what capitalism is? Yep. Okay. You sure? Maybe before the evening is over, we'll have a little discussion about capitalism.
Any teachers in the house? I know if it weren't for my teacher, this event probably would not be possible in the first place. So, Professor Davis, my question to you is, what role do you believe education plays in fostering a more equitable society? And how can it be made more accessible to marginalized communities?
Well, we can't have a more equitable society if education isn't available to everyone. The question of the accessibility of education. But there's also the question of the nature of education, because some people in this country are afraid of certain ideas that circulate in areas where people are trying to learn and others are trying to teach. You know that in a whole number of states, especially in the South, Black studies are not allowed. And critical race theory. Do you remember the controversy around critical race theory? Do you all remember it? And why are they afraid of critical race theory? It is because critical race theory is actually linked to progressive legal studies, trying to understand the nature of the law in this country, and why the law appears to be completely devoid of discrimination, of racism. You know, all men are created equal. Well, there's a problem with that to begin with. The gendering of the human. And so, critical race theory allows us to understand the sometimes deeply problematic nature of U.S. law, where the subject of the law is always seen as a rights-bearing subject, right? We are subjects who, by virtue of living in a democracy, allegedly enjoy certain rights. But there's a kind of hidden racialization that happens because when you think about all men are created equal, they weren't even talking about all men. Anyone who said that or read it understood it to mean white men. And not even all white men. White men who were affluent, who owned property. And so if you look closely, you see that what has been represented as the equality of all human beings is really about a democracy of the minority, which ought to be an oxymoron. Right? The idea is to encourage those who are learning to think deeply and to think along those lines. And that is what the struggle for liberation is all about. Mary Douglas pointed out so long ago that there can be no liberation without education. I talk about that. I grew up in a family of teachers. Both my mother and father were teachers. And so we got tired of listening to them talking about but they did teach us to read when we were, I think we all learned, three of my siblings and I learned how to read when we were 3 years old. And to value the written words. So I deeply appreciate it. I think that's why I became a teacher. Because teachers are some of the most important people. Perhaps the most important people. Consider how little teachers in public schools are paid. Consider how this society does not value those who are responsible for transmitting knowledge and moving it down the generations. But education is... Without education, there's nothing. Let me just say one other thing. Talking for a long time about this, but this is a way to link the work that many of us have been doing around prison issues with the struggle for education. Probably would not think if you hadn't had access to what happens inside prisons, that within prisons there is so much intellectual energy. There's so much education going on, despite the fact that the education does not come from the administration. People in prison often teach themselves how to read and write, and go on to become amazing writers and thinkers. As a matter of fact, I have a number of my colleagues who are professors at the university level oftentimes in graduate studies, tell me that the hardest classes that they've ever taught have been classes in prison. Because if you're locked up in that way, the only way that you can really feel that you're free is by living the life of the mind. And this is why those who survive time behind bars and those who come out rehabilitated, that's a term that we use, it's not because of anything the prison administration does, it's because of their determination to think and to breathe and to write and to speak to each other. And along with that, I think that sisters, brothers, siblings behind bars oftentimes have more to contribute to solving the problems in the so-called free world than those of us who inhabit that free world all the time. So yeah, abolish prison.
Even when we talk about rehabilitation, we read Malcolm X in our Afro history class. We learned about how he educated himself in prison, since that's all he could do. How he found himself through education and through him teaching himself, and not the biased system we live in, we have today. And since you're already on prisons, one of our questions was, how can we best address the systemic inequalities with the prison industrial complex while also promoting safety and rehabilitation? I mean, you already kind of answered this yourself.
What do you mean promoting safety and rehabilitation?
I mean, like, promoting, so often people go into prison, often, they've been through a lot of stuff. In prison, by themselves, the prison doesn't, like you said, prison doesn't help them actually rehabilitate, right? And I guess you kind of already answered the question yourself when you said through education, like that word that actual healing can actually begin. I guess the actual question is, how can we best legally, or like, actually deal with the actual systemic problem with the education and prison pipeline that
the reason I called you on that is because we often think of prisons as places where the bad people in our society are prevented from engaging in activities that will harm us, those of us who are inhabitants of the free world. And that's one of the reasons why prisons have continued to exist for such a long time, because we've been prevented from trying to figure out what will really keep us safe. And if police don't always keep us safe, if prisons don't always keep us safe, then what will? I want to use this as an opportunity to talk about abolition and what it means, because many people assume that when we say down with prisons, abolish prisons, that we want to get rid of prisons or get rid of the police and keep everything else in the world the same, which would make no sense at all. But abolitionists asked us to engage in a reimagination of what it might mean to be really safe. What would be required? If we can't assume that safety requires armed human beings that particularly like to patrol black and brown communities, then what would we need in order to be really safe? Well, for one thing, we would need education. We've been talking about education. And we would need housing for everyone, accessible housing. We would need free medical care. Free mental health care. And so let's go down the line and talk about how we could make changes in our society that would really help to generate a sense of safety, as opposed to assuming that safety requires armed intervention against armed boogeymen or whatever. I mean, I really don't want to underestimate the violence that exists in our worlds. But what I want to suggest is that violence, if it is addressed by wielding more violence, is just going to turn into more and more and more violence. That will not make us safe. So we need to think about structural changes. And this whole notion of structural change came to us, and when I say us, I mean as a population in the U.S. During the COVID era, when people began, some of us have been talking about structural racism forever, as long as I can remember. But it was during the pandemic that there was this mass consciousness, what the French call prise de conscience, about the nature of structural racism. And part of that had to do with the fact that the question was asked, who are the essential workers in our society? That is to say, who are those without whose labor we could not continue to exist? And who were those people? They were indigenous people, they were black people, they were Latinx people, they were Asian people. And so I think for the very first time in U.S. history, the whole notion of structural racism began to make sense. Those were also the people who had to go to work when everyone else was allowed to stay at home. And therefore, those were the people who suffered most during the pandemic. I mean, that's what racism is all about.
Thank you.
As a Black woman activist and scholar in this movement, you have consistently challenged the limitations of mainstream feminism and addressing the unique struggles faced by women of color. And so with that being said, what are your thoughts on the representation of women of color in mainstream feminist movements, and how can these movements become more inclusive?
I've thought about this whole concept of inclusivity, and I have problems with it. I mean, we take for granted that that's the way we should be moving toward greater and greater inclusivity of those who have been kept on the outside of institutions, educational institutions, economic institutions, so forth. But oftentimes we don't ask ourselves, why would people who've been excluded want to be included in a world that remains exactly the same as it was when they were excluded? Now, and I'm not saying this in any way suggest that all of the work that has been done on diversity and inclusion, etc., have made a difference. But I think that sometimes we need to think a little bit more deeply. And even when we are doing this work, we keep in mind that there's some really radical changes that are required. So, for as long as I can remember, I've been trying to suggest that diversity, inclusion, but where's justice? Justice needs to be there somewhere. And transformation of the structures that are responsible for the exclusion in the first place. This is why I've always been opposed to black capitalism. Because the assumption is that black people should be included in the process of exploiting workers. Because that's what capitalism, I said I would say a few words about capitalism. Capitalism is basically about exploitation. These guys, mostly guys, who are billionaires, didn't get all that money because they did the work. They exploited somebody else's labor. And this is why I always encourage my students to read Marx, to read the Communist Manifesto, and to understand that this is at the very core of capitalism is this notion of exploitation. And Marx said that exploitation is not about a moral judgment. It's just about the way the capitalist system works. And you can actually calculate the rate of exploitation if you look at what workers are paid and the difference between what they are paid and what they produce. Right? And so this is why unions have been so important, because they ask for more and more of the work that they have done themselves. And not that they should get it individually so much, because I don't know who needs $100 billion. That's obscene. I don't know. How much money does Jeff Bezos have? Elon Musk? I mean, that's ridiculous, but it can be socially useful. We could have wonderful schools. We could have free education for everyone. Healthcare could cease to be a commodity. It could be something that you get simply by virtue of the fact that you are a human being who inhabits this planet. And I guess I shouldn't forget about our non-human companions. And animals deserve health care as well. I got kind of lost. The conversation was about racism and capitalism. We can spend the rest of the evening meditating on racism and capitalism. Oh no, the question was on black feminism. How did I get to? Because there was a point that I wanted to make. And that is that, it's not so much about being included in mainstream feminism, but transforming the very meaning of feminism. And I think this is what Black feminists, feminists of color have done. What is the most, what is the term that you might associate with feminism today?
Strength.
What is that term that we use when we want to talk about racism and sexism and intersectionality? Exactly. I mean, that is to me the most important intellectual achievement of feminism, and that comes from feminists of color, who always recognize the connection between racism and capitalism and going back to Anna Julia Cooper and black women in the 19th century. That's always been what women of color have insisted on. And that should be mainstream feminism. So that was the point. Sorry, it took a long time.
So, Professor Davis, before we take a break and transition into intermission, I was curious to know if you could share with us a pivotal moment in your early life that influenced your commitment to fighting for social justice and equality.
Well, you know, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the most segregated city in the United States. And so I feel very fortunate to have grown up in a family, as I said, of educators, of a family that considered struggle for equality, the very core of what was needed. And so we were all encouraged to fight against racism. There is something a story that I often tell about growing up in Birmingham, which I think I've brought with me all these years. And that is that we lived on the corner of 11th Court and Center Street. Center Street was the dividing line between the black neighborhood and the white neighborhood. And as such, we were not allowed to cross the street. Black people were not allowed to be on the other side of the street unless they worked for the white people who lived there. And so as kids, we developed a game in which we would dare each other to run across the street. We did it all the time.
Okay, welcome back everyone, and thank you for coming back to your seats in a timely manner. We'll now begin with the second half of our panel with questions from you all.
Unfortunately, we are unable to pass the mic directly to audience members, but we tried to solve this problem by sending out a survey to all who registered to submit questions digitally. Our panelists will now be asking these questions on your behalf.
Okay, we're back. So, I know that a lot of the audience has been wondering, and a lot of people have been wondering, just with the conflict that's going on in Palestine right now, and all that's happening over there right now. We're curious to know, what are your thoughts on the conflict? And I know you've been talking about it for a long time, but as the conflict has come back up into mainstream media, and people are talking about it again, and we're just curious to know what you think about it.
Well, almost as long as I can remember, at least back into my teenage years, I've always fought for justice for Palestine. And I also should tell you that when I visited Palestine in 2011, I told of this story about my imprisonment when I received this very moving letter of solidarity from Palestinian prisoners, Palestinians who were in Israeli prisons. They smuggled the letter out and it made its way from there to here. I was actually I was in jail at that time in Palo Alto, San Jose. And I was telling people there how moved I felt that people who were engaged in a struggle for their freedom, for a struggle for justice in Palestine, would take the time to stand with those who were fighting for my freedom as a political prisoner. And so I told that story a couple of times when I was there. And in Jerusalem, this man came up to me and he said that he had heard that I was talking about solidarity that was offered to me from Palestinian political prisoners in 1970. And he said, I was one of the prisoners who signed that letter to you. And I can't tell you how it made me feel that 50 years later, we were both standing there involved in the same struggles to free our planet, which involves, of course, justice and freedom for Palestine. Struggle that has been very close to my heart since I was introduced to that struggle as a student, as a university student at Brandeis University, which was a university, a Jewish university, founded in the same year as the State of Israel. And what I should let you know was that it was my Jewish friends and classmates who introduced me to the struggle for justice for Palestine. So I learned how to link the struggle against anti-Semitism with the struggle for a free Palestine. Struggles are that they exclude each other. They belong together. And as a matter of fact, in the Bay Area, you've seen that people from Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, progressive, radical Jewish organizations have been in the forefront of the struggle to defeat the war on people in Gaza and the role that the U.S. is playing in providing the arms that are responsible for that devastation. So, yeah, thank you so much. And don't let anyone tell you that to be for the freedom of people in Palestine is equivalent to anti-Semitism.
All right, steering away from such a serious question, we are going to add in some lighthearted ones.
So as a young woman, as a young woman with curly hair, I was wondering what curly hair products you might use.
Okay. I'm laughing because over the years, people have somehow believed that I'm one of the initiators of the Afro, which was not true at all. I was wearing my hair like a lot of other sisters were wearing their hair, but products, okay. I'll tell you about the products only because they are products that help women in parts of Africa. They're made there, and the brand is called Alameda. Has anybody ever heard of Alameda? And I met this brother from Togo, who, I had actually already found them, and I don't like to provide advertisements for Whole Foods, but found it at Whole Foods. And it turned out he was the one who, he was living up in Washington, and he was the one who decided to create these products that are made in I think made in Togo, but that also are the profits are used to support women in several African countries and to encourage small-scale enterprise among African women. But I don't do too much with my hair. I just wash it and put a little conditioner in it, and that's all I do.
All right, back to a little more of a serious question.
I think this is the longest hair conversation that I've had in public.
So we want your thoughts on reparations, and also reparations specifically for African Americans, and like what it would take for a community who has been mistreated by the American government to acquire reparations and get the rightful compensation they deserve.
Yeah, reparations. That's definitely on the agenda. I have a somewhat different take on reparations because many people assume that reparations involves giving individuals who are descendants of people who were enslaved money. And I mean, what good is that going to do? I think that reparations should entail transforming the social institutions in such a way, and let me say, not just for people of African descent, because there would be no Black history if it weren't for indigenous people. Talking about how we pull things apart and separate them in order to try to understand them, and then sometimes we forget that we have engaged in that kind of analytical process, and we assume that they are always separate and unlinked. But if it weren't for indigenous people black people would not have survived. People of African descent would not have survived in this country. And so black history and indigenous history are very much intertwined. So I can't think of reparations for black people without also thinking of reparations for indigenous people. But I don't think it should be about individual sums of money. You know, I think it should be about the things that I've been talking about all evening. It should be about free education for everyone. You know, it's interesting. Many people aren't aware of the extent to which black struggles led to major transformations in the society, even for poor white people. Even for poor white people who were racist. When slavery came to an end, you know, slavery was really abolished when they say it was abolished, because we're still living the afterlife of slavery today. So it's not fully abolished. But the thing is that according to Du Bois, if you read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, he points out that black people wanted justice, and there were political issues, there were political goals, there was economic liberation, there was also education, and freedom didn't turn out to be what many people imagined it to be, because the unfreedom that continued in the aftermath of slavery was sometimes worse than slavery had been. But black people really struggled for education. And that was, and we can see the consequences of that struggle when we look at all the HBCUs that we have now. When we look at the fact that in the South, there was no public education. And black people in the South fought for education, fought for public education. And won that struggle, even though later the schools became segregated. But there were poor white children in the South who never would have had the opportunity to get an education had it not been for the struggle that people of African descent waged in the aftermath of slavery. And then there were also the white people who were a part of that struggle. You know, John Brown has been represented as a crazy man. I mean, I probably shouldn't use that term because, mental illness is a real question. But John Brown was represented as someone who had no idea of what it was he was calling for. And why, people said, well, what is this white man doing? Gathering people together and arming them to try to end slavery. And as it turns out, there were a significant number of white people who passionately believed in the need to end slavery. They don't teach about this. You see, it's not just black, well, that's a part of black studies as well. But we assume that, all the white people were bad, and all the black people. There were some black people who did not want to see slavery end. So let me say that reparations should involve the transformation of the entire society. suffered under the ancestors of people who suffered under slavery, everyone will benefit from that. That is why when you think about what the meaning of the struggle for Black liberation is, or the meaning of the struggle for the liberation of Black women, it's everyone benefits from it. Black women have never only struggled for themselves. Black people have never only struggled for themselves. That is why the Black liberation movement is a movement for radical democracy in this country, in Brazil, and literally all over the world.
Thank you.
So it's just confusion. All jokes aside, I mean, how do you hear and show as someone who struggled with her hair, her natural hair thing, it's really inspiring to see you embrace yourself and all of it and stuff. It's crazy. I have a controversial question to ask. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a hot dog a sandwich?
Listen, I'm vegan. Hot dogs are so dangerous. Twice the next time you order a hot dog. Because it might just kill you. I'm not somebody who says everybody has to be vegan, but I love that. But I think that we should be conscious consumers of the food that is offered to us. We should think about and we should think about how it is produced. We should think about, what harm occurs in the process of producing all of these hot dogs. Because in a lot of ways, our sense of the superiority of human beings replicates racism. And I think that one of these days there's going to be a vast planetary movement around animals and animal justice. And sometimes we're so self-centered as you talk about the races, we're so self-centered and only think that they are the superior human beings. But then, all of us humans tend to be convinced that we're superior to all other forms of life. And that makes for a world in which we think that exploitation and violence is all right when it's inflicted on animals who are non-human. And so I just think we need to think about the world very differently and be conscious of what we do and recognize that there are animals that you would never even consider, like ants. Most people probably do not like. But if you look sometimes at the structures that they create, they're so amazing. The kind of architectural edifices that they produce. And what's interesting is that they don't harm the earth in the process of doing it. Whereas when you think about human interventions, almost everything that is built, that is created, also produces some form of harm to the planet, environmental harm. So there's a lot that we can learn from animals. There's a really interesting book that I read not long ago by a journalist whose name is Ed Yong, Y-O-N-G, I believe. It's called This Immense World. And it's about the ways in which animals perceive this earth that we're living on in very different ways. What the primary senses are, we walk our dogs and they want to smell, right? And so we jerk them because our primary sense is sight. So we're interested in just moving on. Whereas the dog, wants to know and can tell us just from smelling. Who is that here? What's the news today? The dog thing and says, he's reading the news now. They smell, because they figure out who has been there, what they've done there. So it's fascinating, and I think it's really important to live with that kind of openness and willingness to accept other living beings, not as inferiors, but as beings from whom we can learn a great deal.
On this panel with other young people and in a room of young people, but also just people from different generations, what advice would you give to the upcoming generations of activists, and with all that you've learned through your years of fighting for freedom and liberation, what kept you motivated to keep fighting, and what words would you give for us who are still fighting and still finding our way in this world and being activists and empowers and everything?
Well, this could be the beginning, but not a whole 2-hour session. But I think if I had to focus on one issue, I would say community. Say, remember that we accomplished nothing alone. Oftentimes, we tend to think of the world as animated by heroic individual figures. So, there's a movement here, we want to know who is the leader, who is the most important person. And how do we retrain ourselves to think differently? How do we retrain ourselves to want not so much to be acknowledged as an individual, but as a part of a larger community that is responsible for making change in the world? I always like to point out that when we think about what we call the civil rights movement, who do we think about? Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, right? And, they were both amazing figures. But that movement did not happen because of them alone. That movement happened because of vast numbers of people who were willing to stand up together and fight for a better future. And all of what we point out is that many people today are not even aware of this reason for the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. And that is what served as the anchoring moment, and that set off the whole civil rights movement. And the reason that that boycott was successful was that because Black women, domestic workers, who were forced to ride the bus every day from the black community to, white neighborhoods where they weren't. That they were the ones who decided not to ride the bus. And so yes. Well, they are the reason why we're down here as we are today. So I think to learn how to feel acknowledged within the context of a larger group. I know people always ask me to tell them what I hope my legacy will be. And I respond, I don't really care about the individual legacy. That's not, what I'm interested in. But what I am interested in is being a part of a movement that can bring about the kind of change that people will look back on 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and to feel comfortable with being a part of that, rather than having to be singled out as individuals. Individualism is very capitalism. That's one of the reasons why desire will always be recognized as an individual. And of course, I am recognized as an individual, and it's not really been that comfortable, because I know that people assume that I did things that I never even had the capacity to do as an individual. I think that would be the most important thing that I would want to impart to younger activists today.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for the work that you've done, and for you committing yourself to something greater for all generations and all people. And just as someone in this younger generation, I really look up to what you've done, and just everything, and how you remained humble with what you've done, and acknowledging the fact that that you were part of something bigger, for something bigger. And I think that's so important, and thank you.
All right, so we're going to head to our last question for the night. So as time goes on, there are books published. And so, thank you. And so, are there any movies, books, etc., that have that you've been inspired by lately?
Well, this is the beginning of another. There's a book by a brother whose name is Dorsey Nunn. Yay! So, Dorsey in the house. Dorsey is an amazing man who spent many years in prison. He came out and he helped to develop a number of organizations. And he recently released his memoir, which is called What Kind of Bird Can't Fly? By Dorsey Nunn. It's published by Heyday, I think. Heyday, which is in Berkeley. It's a really beautiful, moving, but also, painful story. And I would, that's one thing that I would suggest. Something else, an older book that needs to be read now, needs to be read now, by Sarah McGeesey, who is a Palestinian scholar, and it's called Palestine Inside Out. It's you know, unfortunately, things don't change very much because of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Some of you might remember hearing the IDF leaders, the Israeli Defense Force leaders, talk about Palestinians as human animals, which, you know, I was shocked that that was so ingrained that they didn't even realize that even though they may have thought that, they should have announced to the world that this is why they were involved in this war against people in Gaza. But it's a very detailed, but well-written account of what it's like to live under occupation. And I think that, as I said before, I've been involved in the movement for Free Palestine for most of my life. But when I traveled to Palestine, I was shocked, as were all of us on the delegation, which included, there was a delegation of women of color, feminists, scholar activists, and one of the members of our delegation was born in South Africa, and several of us were from the South. And our response was that we knew it was bad, but we had no idea it was worse than the system of segregation in the South. And you know, not that you should engage in what Elizabeth Martinez, Petita Martinez called oppression Olympics, because that's, but in so many ways, like streets were segregated. It reminded me of, growing up. And I think where I wasn't even allowed to cross the street. That's a great book. Okay, films. I just saw a film. It's a documentary, but an experimental documentary, and you can probably find it online. Called it's a French film called Le Repli, R-E-P-L-I, L-E-R-E-P-L-I, and I think the English title is The Flag. But it's about racism in France, and it's I used to really love French literature because I studied French literature. I visited France. I took seriously the French call for democracy, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And now that vast numbers of black people and people from North Africa, Arabic-speaking people who live in France, the racism in France is horrendous. And this film will allow you to recognize not only what is going on in France, but why we here in this country have a responsibility to stand with those who are struggling against racism in France. We're often used to being the recipient of solidarity. And because black music is popular all over the world, we're often used to the fact that other people know the music that we consider our music. But we don't make the effort to find out what is going on with respect to culture in other places. In Brazil, for example. And I mentioned France. There's an amazing popular singer in France whose name is Aya Nakamura. I know it's a Japanese sounding last name, but that's her stage name, and her ancestry is Malian. She is the most well-known singer, French singer in the world, and has some amazing songs. If you want to, look online. There's a really wonderful song that became very popular called Jaja, DJA. And there's a huge controversy now because she is supposed to represent France at the Paris Olympics. And there are French people, white French people, the conservative white French people, who say that she cannot represent France because she doesn't speak French in the right way. You know, because she uses too much slang. She is the most popular French singer today, and she is amazing. And I'm trying, as someone who studied French literature, studied in France, has had a lot of connections with France over the years, I'm trying to figure out, how we encourage people in this country to stand up against the racism in France. It's interesting that France, that people in France, people in the government of France, challenge racism in this country. As a matter of fact, when I was in jail, there were huge numbers of French people who joined the campaign. But now that the spotlight is on them, and it's racism, it's also Islamophobia. It's like, maybe some of you saw that photograph a few years ago of a white French policeman on the beach in Nice demanding that a woman take off the, what is it called, monokini?
Hijab.
The what?
Hijab.
Burkini, that's right, thank you. And the extent to which women are the targets of the Islamophobia there. I just want to throw that out there because as people who live in the U.S., we're too comfortable with being the recipients of solidarity. We should stand with others who are, it's a global struggle. The nation state as the way in which human beings are organized into communities. I don't think we will have borders. I think we have to imagine a world in which we're all citizens of the world. Act as if we're on that path today.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. It has been an honor. Thank you, audience members. I'm going to hand it over to Natalie to make statements. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for taking the time to spend the evening with us today, and to everyone who sent in questions. We hope you felt as inspired as we did hearing the wise words of Angela Davis.
In both of our schools, members of our clubs have experienced many difficult moments such as hate speech and microaggressions that have hurt our community as a whole. However, what is even worse than these moments is when you feel disregarded or swept under the rug. So to have Angela Davis here sharing her experiences and how she has overcome adversity, even when it seemed impossible, is a testament to what is possible and how it can be done. Her words have not only resonated deeply, but have also sparked a flame within each of us, igniting a passion for change and a commitment to justice. By recognizing these injustices, we hold the power to dismantle them and create the change that we want to see and do. To think that a group of high schoolers can plan, organize, and execute an event this shows you that anything, or virtually anything, is possible as long as you stay dedicated. As we stand here tonight on the shoulders of those who have paved the way before us, we are reminded that change is not only possible, but inevitable when driven by passion and purpose. Be it confronting systemic inequalities, advocating for the voiceless, or challenging norms, we can shape the world around us for the better.
Finally, we'd like to thank everyone who helped and supported us through this planning process. Thank you all for being such a great audience and wish everyone a good night.